This podcast features various sounds of cars driving on the road, so if you're listening to this while driving, be aware. Though you are free to listen to this in any way that is available to you, a good pair of headphones and a dark room are recommended.
So, if you know me, and I mean really know me, you'll know that I have a bit of an interest in the paranormal. I know people mostly know me for my gaming content, but I think stories of ghosts and aliens and cryptids are incredibly fascinating, and that's been true for most of my life. A lot of that comes from my mom. My mom had a wide range of stories from when she was growing up of different things she'd seen over her lifetime. It wasn't the sort of thing she always liked to talk about, but I was part of a trusted few she thought she could open up to. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Buckle in, because there's a long intro ahead full of some necessary housekeeping to put my own mind at ease, if nothing else. And this intro has to be long, because I need to set the tone and provide some ground rules. A base to work from. These are weird topics, and it attracts all kinds of weird, rude skeptics. Now, I shouldn't let the opinions of skeptics bother me. I think skepticism is healthy and necessary, especially when you're talking about paranormal topics. But I do also think some people can go a little too far, and I'm not a fan of that. I'm more of a fan of being curious in all directions, let's say. It's like the famous poster that Fox Mulder has hanging in his office in the X-Files, right? I want to believe. But wanting to believe is not the same thing as believing in everything. And there are always some immutable facts of skepticism, things that hang over fringe topics like these. Like, say, fame and money, right? I went through a phase of listening to Coast to Coast AM, and if you don't know what that is, it's a talk radio show that often deals with ghosts and aliens and conspiracy. The original host was a man named Art Bell, who did the show for decades before passing the torch on to a new host, a man named George Norrie. The show was made famous by Art's dedication to a format called Open Lines, where listeners could call in and relate their stories to whatever the night's topic was. Most of these stories were presented as is, with very little verification or judgment from Art Bell himself. Just as often, Coast to Coast AM would feature a special guest, usually kicking off that night's topic before leading into Open Lines at the end of the show. And just about every guest they've had on Coast to Coast AM was either selling or pitching something. A book, a TV show, a seminar. They were always trying to promote themselves or their business. It's never just a weird encounter or a good story. It's always about getting fame and fortune. To that end, I would like to remind the listening audience at home that my mother died in 2022. What I am about to tell you are things that she technically took to her grave. She spoke to some family about it, but as you'll eventually learn, even the people involved in these events did not want to talk to her about it after it had happened. And some of those people are also now dead as well. If it was not for me, these things would be lost permanently, forever, and I did not want that to happen. Nobody involved in any of this has ever tried to get rich or famous from this stuff. These were secrets kept out of fear, shame, and embarrassment of what others might think. But that means the skepticism then falls on me. I am not a totally neutral party in this scenario. The simple fact that I am sharing this in the way that I am sharing it means that, yes, your viewership means financial earnings for me. But I also know what those kinds of earnings typically look like, and the only way a podcast like this will make me rich is if it reaches an audience of tens of millions of listeners. If you happen to be listening to this on YouTube, even 100,000 views probably isn't enough money to cover more than a single month's rent for me these days. I am also not a paranormal guy. Certainly I have an interest in this topic for reasons that will hopefully become obvious, but I am not a celebrity in this field. I am not talking to anyone who could make me a celebrity in this field. These are things that happened many, many years ago, most of which don't even involve me, and that's the way it will stay. I mainly talk about video games, and I will go back to talking about video games after I am done here. Needless to say, I do not expect to get rich or famous from this. Heck, you may even find parts of these podcasts kinda boring. But this is also just a way for me to keep my mom's memory alive. These are some of the most interesting things she ever told me. Things that captivated me and transformed a good deal of my worldview. And if I tell them to somebody else, then part of her will always live on. Even if it's maybe not necessarily something she'd want blasted out publicly like this. But obviously I'm doing this as much for me as I am anyone else. I don't know when this podcast will be released, but I started writing the script for this literally within a couple months of her death, in April or May of 2022. It has been a long time coming in more ways than one. The format of these podcasts is going to be that I recount one of my mother's encounters with the paranormal to you, and then after the story is over, I'll explore some thoughts I've had about them over the years. Angles I've personally thought about, some of which I brought up with her at the time, and some of which I've kept to myself until now. I'm also not necessarily trying to prove anything here, because at the end of the day, I am my own unreliable narrator. I am telling you these things from memory, and I'll be the first one to tell you that my memory is not always perfect. The thing is, I had spent many years wanting to properly interview my mom about this stuff. I'd wanted to get a written record of these events directly from the horse's mouth, or better yet, an audio recording of some kind. But broaching that topic unprompted always made me feel a little weird, and in the last 10 years of her life, none of these things came up to where I felt comfortable asking her to sit down in front of a microphone. So it's been a while since I've heard these stories, which means I will probably embellish some things. But neither am I trying to deceive anyone. These are not hoaxes, these are not lies, I am not about to tell you fairy tales. This is just me trying to preserve interesting things my mother told me about her life in the best way that I can. Even if I might embellish, and I will, just remember that I'm working from something my mother maintained really did happen to her. And that too is something I'll talk about as we go. As for my personal stance on the paranormal, I do not believe that every mysterious occurrence can be explained as ghosts or psychic energy or what have you. But I am at least open to the possibility that there are forces in this universe we not only do not understand, but may never understand in all of human life. It is a scientific fact that our existence extends beyond the limits of our five senses. We already know that there are colors we cannot see and frequencies of sound we cannot hear. Who's to say it stops there? Sure, we can use science to understand a little bit beyond the limits of our senses, like we know about those undetectable sounds and colors, but you gotta figure that too has its limits, right? We live in three-dimensional space, which defines, up and down, left and right, in and out. But even with some of the most advanced, complex science and mathematics currently available to humans, we struggle to depict and understand anything beyond that. For example, as a species, we're pretty sure a fourth dimension exists, but we really don't know what it is or how to define it. There are several theories on what it could be, but no smoking gun answer. Some have obviously suggested that time could be related to the fourth dimension, or that time and space could be combined to form the fourth dimension, or even that the fourth dimension is an abstract mathematical concept where the shape of geometry changes depending on how it's measured. Like if you view a cube fourth dimensionally, where you view that cube from may change its shape. The important thing to keep in mind is that these are all just suggestions for the concept of a fourth dimension, and they are not the same thing as the universal knowledge we have of the third dimension we currently exist in. Four-dimensional theories are very complicated stuff and not for the faint of heart. And what if there's even more beyond that? Would any of that ever make any sense to us? It's like, imagine you're standing on a beach. You can't walk too far out into the water by yourself because the water gets too deep and you'll drown. So you have this limit of where you can go, but you can still see out across the water. Maybe there are boats out there or an island or something. And eventually you can't see any further because you eventually hit the horizon. The horizon is the limit of what's visible to you. Now, there are obviously things beyond the horizon, and you can make educated guesses as to what's out there, but from where you are standing on the beach, you don't know for sure. To some degree, anything could be beyond that horizon, and you'd never get to see it. We may know our limits as human beings, and even be able to use science to understand what's beyond those limits, but there will always be a horizon we cannot currently see beyond. To me, it seems almost arrogant to assume that humanity can ever know or explain everything that will ever exist. Even for human beings, it is basically impossible to truly understand the scale of just our own galaxy. Never mind the idea that there are hundreds of other galaxies out there, some even bigger than our own, and probably thousands more beyond the reach of even the most powerful telescopes. Tens of thousands of galaxies even. Hundreds of thousands. Each one gigantic, housing suns, moons, and planets. Places that even after 100 generations of constant, non-stop space travel would still be invisible to us. But does that mean they are invisible to every living being to ever exist? Is humanity truly the peak of all life? I mean, we used to think that planet Earth was the center of the universe, you know? There are things out there that human eyes will simply never get to see. Not in any lifetime. Even if you think you understand, neither you or I can truly digest the true cosmic scale of space. I know that we live in an era of instant information. Any question you might have can be answered by a quick search on Wikipedia or Snopes. The internet has led to the death of mystery, and cynical people scoff at the idea that something could still be unknown. But there's a lot more about our life that is unknown than you think, and a lot of people simply pretend otherwise. That sense of mystery behind the truly unknowable has always been incredibly fun and interesting. It's a sense of adventure that I don't think anyone can take away from me. A lot of that comes from my mom and the ideas she put in my head at a young age. I think the first time she told me these stories, I had to be around 10 or 11 years old, maybe 12. I remember the house being dark. We might have suffered a power outage. I remember it was almost like we were sitting around by candlelight, or it was like we had like a single light on in the kitchen or something, but most of the house was very dark. One of my aunts was there with us, someone who has also unfortunately passed on now, but she was someone to corroborate some of these stories. It was the sort of thing where it was very late at night and she was trying to leave and go home. But her and my mom got to talking, and as they often did, it turned into an hours-long conversation. Hearing it affected me a great deal because, unlike your typical scary campfire story, I was being told about real events. It stuck with me and maybe even permanently altered the course of how I think about life on this planet. I know this is a long intro and we're still not even done yet because I think you also deserve a proper introduction to the kind of person my mother was in order to have the right perspective of what you're about to hear. My mom was a moderately religious woman. She considered herself a Christian, though she very rarely went to church or listened to many sermons. But she kept a very well-worn Bible with her favorite verses highlighted and underlined. She kept her faith in her own way and loved to do something she called planting a seed. That is, doing a good deed for someone unprompted so that the kindness may grow and blossom for others and hopefully for her too. She was also one of the few people in her family to avoid recreational substances. Her mother and father, my grandma and grandpa, were fatal alcoholics. Many of her brothers and sisters had periods in their lives where they were involved with mind-altering substances of various types. By contrast, I only ever visibly saw my mother drink alcohol maybe 3 times in the 38 years we shared on this earth, and rarely more than a single sip. When it came to drugs, my mom was usually afraid of them. She maintained that just the smell of marijuana gave her a migraine, and she was even paranoid about basic medicines like Tylenol. Simply put, she did not like drugs in any way, shape, or form, and that was something that began to frustrate her doctors as she got older. Basically, for the vast majority of her life, my mother was stone cold sober and of sound mind and body. On top of that, she was also honest to a fault. I watched even the most simple little white lies twist that woman into knots. She was the type that would rather hurt herself than hurt those around her. But it only reinforced the idea that when she talked about what she experienced, she would not have been lying. It was very difficult for her to lie, and basically impossible for her to maintain a lie over the long term. She was also fiercely strong and independent. Divorced 3 times, she raised me and to some extent my older brother as a single mother in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. It's harder to imagine now, but the concept of a single mother raising children alone used to be pretty controversial, and my mom was in the first waves of that particular movement. And she was intelligent too. In the late 1960s, she worked at Ball Aerospace, wiring circuit boards for NASA satellites. In the 80s, she studied to become a legal secretary. When her brothers and sisters had tech problems, they would occasionally turn to my mom to help fix it. And yet, she developed an odd relationship with technology. There's a term out there for what used to be called electric people, or magnetic people. My mom was one of them. She couldn't wear certain types of mechanical wristwatches because she would magnetize the gears inside. Electronic devices like mobile phones were more likely to start malfunctioning when they were in her hands. It was the sort of thing where she'd complain about her phone not working right, and the moment she would set it down or pass it to me, the problem would vanish. She just had to stop touching it. And like a lot of these so-called electric people, she seemed to have a tendency to cause light bulbs to burn out whenever they were near. I saw it more times than I can count. We'd be out walking the dogs together in the evening or driving somewhere late at night, and as we passed under a streetlight, it would blink out. How often it would happen depended on how stressed she was. If she was under pressure at work, there would be some nights where 2, 3, even 4 lights would burn out in a single car ride, and light bulbs at home would often last less than half of their reported lifespan. Don't ask me how she got away with working at Ball Aerospace, because I don't know. For what it's worth, I'm pretty sure that job was short-lived. The theory has been put forth that these so-called electric people have strong psychic energy, making them magnets not just for electrical power, but for other forms of energy too. I don't know if I would personally go far enough to believe that, but I will say that her observable magnetic traits were never passed down to me, and my experiences with the paranormal have also been very limited, comparatively speaking. But even from an early age, something was strange about my mother. She once told me that as a little girl, no more than 4 or 5 years old, she believed she was from the planet Venus. She had faint, hazy memories of looking up in her grandma's kitchen and seeing an empty pie plate hung on the wall. It resembled the shape of a UFO, literally a flying saucer, and she could recall thinking to herself, "They're going to come back for me." She told me that she didn't really believe that, or at least not as an adult anyway, but it is still a little weird for a toddler to internalize, apropos of nothing. Unidentified flying objects in general were something my mom had a lot of experience with. Like many in the 1990s, she was struck by UFO fever thanks to movies like Fire in the Sky, plus television shows like Sightings and The X-Files. She excitedly watched special reports, like when the Fox network broadcast their alien autopsy. But she often came away from those TV specials disappointed, because many of them were clearly fakes, some of them being so campy they were approaching parody. That's because she had seen the real thing. If I look at the timeline of things, I can remember my mother telling me the earliest one in her life must have been in the car with her family, which, as we'll learn, ends up being kind of a running theme here. My mom was a baby boomer, so this would have been somewhere around the mid to late 1950s, if not the early 1960s. She was packed into the car with the entire rest of her family. Her mom, dad, 2 brothers, and 2 sisters. Being the oldest child, she was maybe 13 or 14 at this point, with the rest of her siblings probably being under the age of 12. If I remember right, they were on their way home after visiting some relatives, aunts and uncles or something, and were now driving home. It had gotten dark, and it was a long drive on an old country road, effectively out in the middle of nowhere. Nothing but huge stretches of farmland with the occasional thicket of trees to break things up. If you've never been too far out from a city, it can get pretty spooky late at night. On those old back roads out away from city lights, things can get oppressively dark. And this was most likely when there were even fewer streetlights out on roads like this, leading to nothing but a solid, inky blackness waiting for you outside the passenger window. Anything or anyone could be out there, watching you, and you'd never know it. It's just you, your headlights, and the endless night. At times like this, seeing another car out on the road felt like a rare blessing. It was a reminder that you weren't alone out there in the darkness, even if you were in a packed car with 5 kids. But what they encountered that night wasn't exactly another car on the road. It came into view out the passenger window of the car, a light like a lamp streaking across an open field from far away. My mom always described it like the headlight on a train. It was too dark to see what it was attached to, just that it was racing through this open, pitch-black field, and it was coming right at them.
Oh my God.
There were only seconds to react. This vehicle, or light, or whatever it was moving fast and it was closing in. Everyone began to panic. Keep in mind, we're talking like 1950s cars here. There's no anti-lock brakes, no airbags, and no protection against a fatal car accident. Trying to avoid a collision was often just as dangerous as getting hit. This giant light, this freight train was barreling down on them, almost at the car now. Time was up. All anyone could do was brace for impact. There was a flash. Everything went white. Seconds passed. It must have felt like an eternity. When my mom opened her eyes, nothing. The car was fine, she was fine, everyone was fine, and the light was gone. It was unearthly quiet. Nothing happened. It was like the light had just vanished into thin air. Everyone sat in stunned silence. As they got back into town in the comfort of streetlights, she made sure to look and see if there were any cars following them. Maybe it was just a prank. But they were alone on the road. Finally, someone in the car broke the silence.
What just happened?
Grandpa was quick to reply, "Just shut up." Everyone complied. My grandpa was known to have quite the temper. More than just an alcoholic, my grandpa was a fierce bulldog of a man. He apparently told my mom that he had killed men before over something as trivial as a pocket watch. She told me she suspected he might have been involved with the mafia because they never lived in one town for more than a few months. She'd come home from school some days and find her room already packed and in the car because they were leaving town that night. It's like they were running from something, or more specifically, from someone. So when he told you to keep quiet, you did it, because there was no telling what he was capable of doing. As far as she's ever told me, the rest of her family refused to acknowledge that anything had happened that night. When I think about it, even my mom did not tell me this story until well after Grandpa died of heart failure in the early 90s. She may have been avoiding any possible repercussions from him. I don't know what to make of that story nowadays. Knowing Grandpa's apparently violent history, the light they saw that night could have been a lot of things. But the way that my mom told it, it was a narrow road, and there wasn't really any way it could have been a person. When she described the light as looking like a train was coming at them, she meant it was mounted up high, at least 10 or 15 feet. It couldn't have been a car. And the fact that it just disappeared without an impact or even making a sound is even stranger. There is no normal explanation for what happened that night. But my mom had other strange encounters with lights in the darkest nights. It probably wasn't that long after Grandpa had died, really. Around the mid-1990s, so we're jumping forward in time by, 30 or 40 years. Thanks to her legal secretary training, my mom had gotten a pretty decent job doing data entry for one of the largest businesses in the state of Colorado. It wasn't super illustrious, they mainly handled mailing services for different magazines, but this was in the days before a computer could scan all of that information automatically. It had to be typed by hand by an actual human, and my mom had basically gone to school to be a typist. Demand was high enough that it ranked as one of the best paying jobs she ever had. But the hours were long, the strain on her hands was intense, and the commute itself wasn't exactly short. The office was located 2 towns away in Boulder. This often meant that my mom was driving to work before sunrise and getting home just after sunset. Boulder is set near the base of the Rocky Mountains, and traveling there meant taking a lot of winding country roads that snaked in and around steep hills and jagged cliffs. It was one particularly dark morning that my mom was driving to work. She didn't like taking the main streets, she had an inherent paranoia of heavy traffic, so rather than take Arapahoe Road, which would have been a straight shot into Boulder, she drove a mile north and took a back road called Valmont. This was quieter, less stressful, and it usually meant that she was the only car out at this time of the day. Valmont has a couple of S-curves, practically right next to each other, one big and one small. From the direction my mom was coming, she would have hit the big one first and then the little one. This morning, she was not alone on the road. Another car was following her, practically tailgating her. My mom was a saint in many regards, and that included being the safest driver I've ever seen. She never even so much as exceeded the speed limit if she could help it, and in her 60-plus years on the road, she'd only ever had a single speeding ticket on file, which was later thrown out in the court when it became apparent that the traffic cop only stopped her to meet his quota for the day. But that often meant dealing with situations like this, where the person behind her was riding her tail in an effort to push her to go faster. But my mom could also be very stubborn. If people had a problem with her obeying the speed limits, she'd objectively refuse to speed up out of defiance, if nothing else. Nobody could make her break the law. As she came up on the second, smaller S-curve, something caught her eye between the trees. In the dim pre-dawn, 2 lights hovered a good 300 feet off the ground, illuminating the fields below as if it were daylight. From what she could tell, they weren't suspended by anything. This did not appear to be construction equipment. The lights themselves were also massive, far bigger than most lighting fixtures would be. She described it almost like stadium lighting. 2 big round spotlights blasting the fields with an intense illumination. Not moving, and as far as she could tell, not making any sound. just hanging out in the middle of a big, empty field, completely alone. Her first instinct was to slow down and get a better look, but there was that car behind her, and Valmont Road was almost entirely a double yellow zone, meaning there was no passing allowed. If she slowed down too suddenly, she could be risking a car accident. Her only option was to keep driving. Whether they realized it or not, the car behind her was successfully pushing her, but that meant not getting a good look at whatever was happening off the side of the road. By the time she went back through that area going home, the lights were gone, and there was never any visible evidence of any kind of equipment being set up in that field. This is always a story I've looked at with more skepticism. I do believe my mom saw something she couldn't explain, sure, but the reason she can't explain it is because it was pretty far away and she couldn't get a good look at it. There could be a huge discrepancy between what she thought she saw and what it actually was, and I think she realized that. But when she'd talk about it, she'd always talk about it in the context of our next story, and you'll see why. The story you just heard is mainly a little weird. One of those things that makes you stop and go, huh. But there's just not enough to go on to say one way or the other what it could have been. For our final story, there is something my mom told me about once that seems fairly irrefutable, assuming you share my belief in the truth behind her words. Once again, like all of these stories, it begins in a car at night. We're going back in time to maybe 10 or 15 years before the lights in the field. At this point in time, my mom was a fully grown, fully independent adult. My mom, her sister, and my brother were driving to see my grandma and grandpa. I hadn't been born yet, but my brother being here puts this somewhere around the 1970s or possibly even the very early 1980s. They were in a scenario not unlike our first story, one of long, dark country roads. Ironically, she always told me this story when we were out near Valmont. You'd come off Highway 287 onto Isabel Road, take it up to 95th Street, and then from 95th to Valmont. That sequence of turns always triggered this memory for her, either because that's where this actually happened, or because it simply reminded her of where this story starts. It was kind of a night like any other. Cool and quiet, perfect for driving. My mom flipped her turn signal and took the next road, only to discover a scene was playing out just around the corner. A block or two up on this little old road were a handful of cars parked along the shoulder, with people just standing there. Some were standing next to their cars, while others were crossing the street to get a closer look at something. Just off the road, in a field beyond a group of trees, was a spaceship just floating there. Some of the more curious people were starting to gather under it. My mom said it was big, probably half the size of a football field, hovering 50 to 100 feet off the ground. Kind of your basic classic saucer shape and covered in bright lights. Much like the lights from our previous story, they lit up the field below. What happens next is a little strange. My mom suddenly remembers being under the ship herself, but she had no memory of parking the car or getting out. And according to her, she was alone in that field directly beneath the ship, looking up at it. It was close enough that she could see what she described as rivets where panels of the ship had been bolted together. The people that had been gathering under the UFO weren't around anymore, nor were my brother or aunt. She was seemingly by herself. Looking back up at the ship, she recalled seeing windows where she could see shapes moving around, as if there were creatures watching her. She also had a distinct memory of the way it felt being under the ship. She said it was strangely warm, almost like the air itself was electrified. If you've ever had an MRI scan, I imagine that must be pretty close to what this felt like. She recalled the ship being so close that it was almost like she could reach out and touch it. The next thing she remembers, she's suddenly back in the car again, and my brother and aunt are with her. Once again, absolutely no memory of leaving the UFO, getting back in the car, or anything of that sort. One moment, she's under the ship, and the next, she's racing home to tell my grandma and grandpa. Grandpa had been an avid listener to Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM radio show. He was desperate to see a UFO of his own someday, and this seemed like his chance. So, after explaining what had happened, they picked him up and excitedly raced back out to the field where the ship was. When they got there, they discovered that the whole place was empty. No cars, no people, and no signs of the spaceship. Everything was gone. Much like the first story with the mysterious train light, afterwards, all parties involved denied that anything had ever happened. Both my aunt and my brother refused to admit that they had seen anything. My mom had memories of trying to bring it up with my brother in particular several times, and he would always shut her down. He never wanted to talk about it. Not with her, not with anyone. I think that's part of the reason why my mom would tell me these things specifically. I was one of the few family members she could share these memories with. Someone who would actually listen and not judge her. She was obviously very self-conscious. No matter how many times she told me these stories, no matter how much it seemed like I was on board with her, there would invariably come a moment where she would stop and look embarrassed. More than once, she accused me of not believing her, because it seemed like nobody else did, not even the people that were there with her when these things happened, apparently. Rather than confront and change their worldview that these sorts of things could potentially exist within our universe, they chose to bury these memories, pretend they never happened, and forget. Which is ultimately why I've chosen to create this podcast. My mom always wanted greater acceptance of these topics to get some small shred of validation that she wasn't crazy. And I never believed my mother was crazy. I want her stories to live on. These were just things that happened to her, things she only confided with those she was closest to. The story of the spaceship in the field is one of the wildest things she ever told me. It was in one particular retelling of this story to me that she suddenly remembered she had no memory of parking her car, getting out, or going under the spaceship. To her, the memories blended together so seamlessly that she never questioned it until almost 20 or 30 years later. Similarly, arriving at Grandma and Grandpa's that night, they were apparently over an hour late. This means that there was a big chunk of time between encountering the UFO and leaving that cannot be accounted for. Missing time like that is a common feature in stories about alien abductions. Though my mom never admitted it to me, one of the only other people she trusted to talk about this with was her younger sister, and I caught them once talking about alien abductions in private. It was one of those conversations when you're a kid where the adults are talking about something you know you're not supposed to be hearing because they awkwardly stop their conversation the moment you enter the room. I don't think my mom believed that she was abducted, and I don't believe she was abducted either. But then again, I guess I wouldn't know one way or the other, given I can't really ask her at this point. But I do think the possibility was on her mind at the very least. To my memory, that's the last of the stories from my mom about her encounters with unidentified flying objects. And as I said at the start of this podcast, my own experiences are very limited. Obviously, you hear stories like this growing up, you fall in love with the mystery of how strange it all sounds, and there's a part of you that wishes it would happen to you. But when you really break it down, I don't actually want any of this to happen to me. When people who claim to be abducted by aliens recount their memories, it's never pleasant, you know? The X-Files did a whole episode about abductees who found strange pieces of metal implanted into their bodies. And though the episode was fantasy, it was based on real claims that some have made. And those people were not happy it had been done to them. There are accounts of people who have just observed UFOs suffering lasting physical damage, such as the Falcon Lake incident in Canada, where Steve Michalak suffered radioactive burns that left visible scars he carried his entire life. As you might imagine, the Peanut Gallery has had endless debate over whether these burns were self-inflicted or not. Just in the process of putting together this podcast, the Falcon Lake entry on Wikipedia has swung between presenting Michalak's case as is to presenting his story with a more doubtful eye, including numerous quotes from dedicated skepticism publications that frame Steve Michalak as an alcoholic that injured himself while camping. On the other hand, before he died in 1999, Steve Michalak allegedly demonstrated that his wounds returned at regular intervals throughout his life, something that can be true of real radioactive burns. But needless to say, if these claims are true, it's a lot of trouble that I'd rather avoid. Now, I have seen something I could not explain, however. But before anyone jumps to any conclusions, I just want to stress that I don't even know if it was a UFO. Or, well, it was a UFO, but only in the traditional literal sense. It was something I could not identify, it was flying, and it was an object. That is the textbook definition of a UFO. It was pretty recent, too. April of 2018. By this point, I was still living with my mom, and we left Colorado and moved to Nevada, where my brother lives. My niece was having her birthday party in a few days, and my mom and I were night owls, so we were up late. It was probably around 10:30 p.m. Mom was spending this particular night baking a birthday cake to take to the niece the next day. Since the trash can in the kitchen was full and we needed to put a fresh bag in it, I pulled the existing bag of trash and carried it out to the dumpster behind our apartment. I'd heard a quote once, many years ago, during some TV special my mom had watched or something, that part of the reason that so few people notice UFOs is because nobody looks up into the sky at night. Ever since hearing that, I'd made a specific point to look up whenever I'm outside. And for many years, it resulted in nothing. But on this particular night, I saw something. The apartment complex we were living in sat nestled up against the back of a strip mall just off the major road leading through the city. In the other direction, past our gigantic apartment complex, began a more traditional stretch of residential housing. Between our apartments and the strip mall was a concrete divider topped with a chain-link fence, and the dumpster I was heading to was nestled up next to the parking spaces that lined this fence. So I come down the stairs from our apartment, hook around the corner going to my left, and then take another left to follow the sidewalk down to the parking lot so that I can cut across and drop the trash in the dumpster. It's a small detail, but I could have also gone to the right instead and actually made a shorter trip to the dumpster. But the apartments on that side were lined with windows, and given that it was getting late, I wanted to avoid bothering anyone at this time of night. As I dropped the trash into the dumpster, I looked up. In the sky, entering from the southwest and heading northeast, was a bright red light traveling across the sky. It crested the strip mall and then disappeared over the apartment roof, being visible for around, I will say like 3 to 4 seconds. By the time I got back around to the other side of the unit where I had a clearer view of the eastern horizon, it was gone. I point out how long it took to cross the sky because I want you to envision something in your head. I want you to think about airplanes. If you've seen airplanes in the sky with the naked eye, they are often so high up that they appear to be moving very slowly. An airplane crossing this same distance in the sky would have taken between 30 seconds and a full minute. If we're talking satellites, they're even higher up, at an altitude of over 1,000 miles. That means that when we see one, they take even longer to cross the sky. A satellite traveling across this portion of the sky could be measured in multiple minutes. I've also watched meteor showers, so I've seen my fair share of shooting stars. Not only was this too big and too bright to be a shooting star, but those often move so quickly that you can literally blink and miss them. For the lower, brighter shooting stars, they often leave trails behind them. I've seen those in person too. There was one meteor shower, I think around 2010, where my mom and I got in the car and drove out away from the city lights to get a better view of the night sky. And not to get on a tangent here, but even just 5 miles out of town tripled our ability to see shooting stars. It was beautiful. And one of those shooting stars just happened to be one of those low-orbit meteors, which streaked across the sky in a brilliant trail of green fire, looking more like fireworks than anything else. It was a once-in-a-lifetime event. The flying object I saw in 2018 was nothing like that. It was a singular red light, seemingly affixed to the underside of some sort of craft, given that there seemed to be the shadow of something around it. There were no other lights attached to it to mark the tips of wings or a tail or anything. Nothing was flashing, there was no strobing, just this one solid red light. 1 1000, 2 1000, 3 1000, 4, and it was gone. Too fast to be an airplane or a satellite, too slow to be a shooting star, and completely silent. There wasn't even any wind in the trees. That means it couldn't have been a consumer drone either. If you've ever been near one of those things, they are effectively flying lawnmowers. You can hear them buzzing from a mile away. Airplanes aren't exactly silent either, if you think about it. Whatever this was, it did not make a sound, and it could have been at an altitude of under 1,000 feet, given how close and how bright the light appeared. As it sank in that I just saw something legitimately weird, I hurried back to the apartment to tell my mom. As I was describing the event to her, a jet quickly buzzed past our building, like a fighter jet kind of jet. It was the sort of thing where at first it sounded like a big gust of wind, this great whoosh that rattled our windows, but after it had passed, there was the familiar roar of a jet engine. It must have been going pretty fast. As if that wasn't weird enough, a few minutes later, it made a second pass. To this day, I'm still not sure what I saw. I'd be willing to say that it was possibly some kind of glider, but at such a low altitude entering a residential area, that seems pretty dangerous, and the jet trailing behind it only makes the event more mysterious. One part of this story I don't think I ever have talked about before is what happened later that night. Because to this day, I don't even know if it was real or just my imagination. It was close to an hour after I'd seen that red light in the sky. In the process of baking the birthday cake for my niece, my mom suddenly realized she didn't have any frosting, nor enough ingredients to make any from scratch. Not wanting to drive anywhere alone this close to midnight, we both piled into the car and headed to the store to buy a can of frosting. As we were pulling out of the apartment parking lot, I continued to look up into the night sky, wondering if what I'd seen was still out there. What I saw next almost took my breath away. Faintly, against the mountains separating Nevada and Lake Tahoe, this time I saw what I would describe as a shooting star. But this one seemed to be going straight up, accelerating into the darkness above, where it quickly disappeared. It was so dim and moving so fast that a part of me is convinced it must have been my eyes playing tricks on me. The wonder and excitement causing me to see something that might not have actually been there, a floating wisp in my vision. But what if it wasn't just the excitement? What if I'd actually seen something more than just a strange red light? I'll never know. Nobody will. Even if you think you have an explanation, you weren't there. All you have is an assumption of what it could be, but that's not the real answer. There will very likely never be a real answer. The same is increasingly true for the stories my mom told me. Most of the people in these stories are dead now, and the few that are still living apparently don't want to talk about it. To be honest, I'm a little worried what might happen if they find this podcast and listen to me airing what they might see as my mom's dirty laundry. I'm even a little scared they might finally open up about what happened on some of these nights and start arguments that could spoil the childlike wonder that I felt for so many decades. Mysteries are fun, and sometimes they are fun as mysteries. Things that don't have an answer. I feel like we as a society have forgotten that, and it's important for me to preserve these mysteries as what they are to me. Maybe they aren't super interesting or super detailed, and I'll take responsibility for some of that because I really should have taken the initiative to get my mom's personal accounts of these events while she was still alive. They were enough to captivate me for a lifetime, and I worry that I'm not doing them justice here or telling them in the way she would have told them. But that's no excuse for keeping them a secret. At least now, these mysteries can live on in some part, in some way, for as long as this recording survives. And with them, a part of my mother will never be forgotten. That's all that really matters.
This has been part 1 of 2 of a collection of strange encounters, as retold in podcast form by Ryan Bloom. If you'd like to be notified when the next episode goes live, consider subscribing. Paid premium members also receive podcasts early, so if you have the means, consider chipping in a couple bucks. You can find more information on how to subscribe at bltn.net. Music used in this podcast includes remixed and transformed versions of songs from Addams' Family Values for the Super Nintendo, Ecco the Dolphin for the Sega CD, plus Metroid Prime and Metroid Prime 2 for the Nintendo GameCube. Some ambient tones were also recorded from the Generative.fm website, an open-source project that generates endless ambient music. A number of the sound effects used in this podcast were also sourced from the Freesound Audio Repository, a collaborative library of royalty-free music and sound effects. You can visit its website at freesound.net. New videos will resume soon. As always, check bltn.net for the latest updates or Ryan's social media. We hope to see you again on the next episode.